ice counters are a mechanic that are only interacted with by 6 cards in the game. And while counter mechanics are inherently kinda bad, because they require face-up cards in the field to do anything, and face-up cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Don't last very long, ice counters themselves are kinda unique in the fact that they don't really have a unifying theme in what they actually do. In the very first wave of ice counter monsters, they released Cold Enchanter and Ice Master in 2008, alongside powerful single monsters like YuGiOh Guardian and Stardust Dragon. Although the power level of these 2 ice counter monsters are nowhere near as strong as a lot of the other stuff that was released in their same pack. Cold Enchanter is a level 4 monster with 1600 attack and has a non-once per turn effect where you can discard 1 card from your hand in order to place an ice counter on a face-up monster on the field. And then Cold Enchanter gains 300 attack for each ice counter on the field. So if you use the effect a single time and place an ice counter on itself, it can go up to 1900 attack, which is definitely not worth the -1 in card advantage. One of the few unique things about Cold Enchanter is the fact that it allows you to theoretically discard an infinite amount of cards from your hand, in case you need to do that for whatever kind of infinite combo, as there aren't a lot of cards that have non-once per turn effects like this anymore. Although the ice counters didn't really do anything except provide this 1 attack boost, and they didn't really start doing anything else until later cards were introduced, which wouldn't happen until 4 years later. Next up we have Ice Master. According to Wikipedia trivia, Ice Master is probably the future version of Cold Enchanter, and is a level 8 monster with 2500 attack, which has the effect where it can special summon itself from your hand by tributing 2 water monsters. Then, once per turn it can place an ice counter on a face-up monster for free, and it has a final effect where it can tribute itself in order to destroy all monsters that have ice counters on them. So, if you use its effect to place 1 ice counter on one of your opponent's monsters, you can tribute this card in order to destroy it, which is definitely not worth the amount of resources required in order to bring it out. Because while the card can special summon itself from your hand, you need 2 specific attributes of monsters in the field in order to accomplish this. The card was given some support 13 years later in 2021 with the release of Crystal Girl, which does actually allow you to search out Ice Master and give it an attribute fodder on the field a lot easier, so that you can bring out Ice Master without losing too much card advantage. Although you still have the problem of not being able to put out ice counters very efficiently, and there's the problem that the card has to tribute itself in order to gain the effect. If the card simply just allowed you to destroy all monsters with ice counters once per turn without tributing itself, it still wouldn't be very good. So having to remove this monster from your field on a spell speed 1 effect for this kind of effect just makes it laughably bad. In 2012, they released 4 more cards with ice counter support. First up, we have Snow Dragon, a level 4 monster with 1400 attack, which has the effect that if it's destroyed by battle or card effect, you can place 1 ice counter on each face-up monster on the field, including your own monsters. This could provide a huge attack boost for Cold Enchanter, but the card itself fundamentally doesn't do anything with ice counters either. It just provides a mediocre way of maybe placing a whole bunch of ice counters in the field, if there's a whole bunch of monsters in the field to carry them. Next up we have SNOWMAN Creator. This is a level 4 monster with 1600 attack that has an effect where, when it's summoned, you can place a number of ice counters on your opponent's monsters, equal to the number of water monsters you control. And then additionally, if you place 3 more ice counters with the effect, you can destroy any 1 card your opponent controls. Now, the thing to note about SNOWMAN Creator is that the effect happens on normal or special summon, so if you're able to cheat this card into the field, you do have a way to get a lot of ice counters in the field potentially, and you might be able to destroy 1 card. Although you would need to have 2 other water monsters on your side of the field first if you want to activate the destruction effect, which is a lot harder to get off than you would think. You have to remember that a lot of these effects have to be compared to the mass amount of disruption that exists in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But even back in 2012, the game was too fast for the slow acclimation of ice counters, and using up a resource to bring out SNOWMAN Creator to destroy 1 card maybe was usually just better spent on doing something else. Technically, the effect of being able to destroy 1 card and place a lot of ice counters is not half bad. It's just the ice counters themselves don't really do anything, and it's just slightly too hard to pull off the destruction effect. If it only required you to place 2 ice counters to get a destruction effect, it would still be a little bit too slow. However, if it only required 1 ice counter to be placed to use the effect, it might actually be a really good staple, to be honest. Since the card itself is a water monster, so it's always going to be able to provide at least 1 ice counter for its effect. Although if the card just required there to be 3 or more ice counters in the field total when it was summoned, instead of having to place all the ice counters itself, that would also make it a lot more usable. The idea behind this effect is not half bad, it's just a little bit too difficult to pull off. Definitely one of the better ice counter cards. Next up we have SNOWDUST Giant. This is a rank 4 Xyz monster which requires 2 level 4 water monsters as its materials, and this card has 2 effects. One of them allows it to place ice counters on any number of face-up monsters in the field equal to the amount of water monsters you reveal from your hand. And then it has a passive effect which actually grants the ice counters some form of effect, where non-water monsters on the field lose 200 attack for each ice counter on the field. So if you're playing an Ice Counter deck, SNOWDUST Giant is probably one of the cards you want to get out as soon as possible, because it's the only one that actually has detrimental effects to your opponent's monsters based on the amount of Ice Counters out, instead of previously where they just provided an attack boost for Cold Enchanter, or maybe allowed you to destroy them with Ice Master. An interesting thing to note about SNOWDUST Giant's effect is that it reduces the attack of monsters based on the amount of Ice Counters in the field total. It doesn't actually matter if a monster has an Ice Counter on it or not. So you can just put all the Ice Counters on SNOWDUST Giant itself in order to debuff an entire opponent's field, assuming they don't have any water monsters, which is actually a good way to go about handling counters. The best archetypes that handle counters inside of them usually let you hold on to the counters yourself so that you have more control over them, or have incredibly detrimental effects if they're placed on your opponent. And while an attack boost isn't the best kind of effect to have, SNOWDUST Giant is easily the best Ice Counter card so far. And finally, we have SNOWDUST Dragon. This is a level 8 monster with 2800 attack, which can special summon itself from your hand by removing 4 Ice Counters from anywhere on the field. And it also provides another negative benefit to Ice Counters, where other monsters that have Ice Counters on them cannot attack or change their battle positions. So if you take all the Ice Counter cards which actually give effects to Ice Counters, what they do is provide Cold Enchanter 300 attack for each, cause non-water monsters to lose 200 attack for each, and cause each creature that has one to not be able to attack or change their battle position. And also, with Ice Master, makes it so you can destroy monsters that have Ice Counters on them. So you can see that half of the effects with giving some kind of benefit to Ice Counters incentivize having them on your own cards, while the Ice Counters themselves seem to be incentivized around being on your opponent's cards, since SNOWMAN Creator can only place them on your opponent's cards, and Cold Enchanter, Ice Master, Snow Dragon, and SNOWDUST Giant can place them on monsters on both players' side of the field. So SNOWDUST Dragon kind of creates a dichotomy of the Ice Counters, where it technically has a beneficial effect for you in order to debuff monsters with Ice Counters, but it kind of also restricts your ability to make use of them with SNOWDUST Giant and Cold Enchanter, since if you place a whole bunch of Ice Counters on SNOWDUST Giant, it will no longer be able to attack if SNOWDUST Dragon hits the field. Although SNOWDUST Dragon does require you to remove 4 Ice Counters from anywhere on the field to bring it out. So you could just remove the counters from your own monsters and leave them on your opponents if a whole bunch of them were placed on everything with a Snow Dragon getting destroyed, for example. Which is to say, counters are kind of counterintuitive with each other, where some of the cards gain benefits from them being on the field, where they're best left on your own monsters, and others provide detriments to creatures that have the Ice Counters on them, where you want to have them on your opponent's monsters. And none of these effects are really worth the headache of juggling around all the Ice Counters in the first place. You see, these 6 cards are the only cards in the game that interact with Ice Counters, and they don't even really combo well with each other. Out of them, you could probably just play SNOWDUST Giant in some kind of water-based deck and just ignore all the other Ice Counter support, since SNOWDUST Giant can provide a pretty hefty AoE attack decrease to your opponent's cards, which could actually be useful. And SNOWMAN Creator might allow you to pop choice cards if you want to special summon it easily, and you control a lot of water monsters. All the other ones, though, are kind of mediocre in what they're able to do with Ice Counters and aren't super worth considering. And as far as Ice Counters go, that's kind of it. They haven't released any new Ice Counter support since 2012. None of the Ice Counter cards really saw any competitive play, and it's basically just a failure of mechanic that was kind of abandoned like a lot of the other counter systems, where only a handful of them have seen any kind of competitive play. Like the Endymion archetype with spell counters, or even Cosmic Slicer Zerol, since it's able to create a lockdown with Alien Kid or Planet Pollutant Virus, and stops monsters that have 8 counters on them from activating their effects. So, what could they do to Ice Counters in order to make them more competitive? Well, Ice Counters themselves are so inherently clunky and anti-synergistic that they would just have to create new cards and interact with them, or just choose one of the old cards and base an entire archetype around that one alone. At least SNOWDUST Giant can kind of ignore its archetype and just handle Ice Counters by itself. But if they had more cards similar to SNOWMAN Creator, where they get to place Ice Counters and then destroy things, and then maybe actually granted some kind of effects to those Ice Counters, that might make them a little bit better. Alright, and that's the video. If you know of any other failed mechanics or cards in Yu-Gi-Oh that you'd like to see me cover, please let me know down in the comments.